Mr. Parrish, in your testimony, you've identified numerous examples of the Army Corps implementing the Waters of the U.S. rule despite the nationwide stay. Because of this implementation, farmers are losing the ability to manage their land and utilize it in the best way possible. Can you explain the impact of this early implementation of the WOTUS rule and what it could have in terms of an impact on ag production in the United States?
From a global perspective, we saw a shift in the EPA and the Corps exerting jurisdiction back about 3 years ago. And what we're seeing is not just them having an impact on the practices that farmers use, we're seeing an actual impact on the way farmers can use their land, and actually prohibitions on the way that they propose to use their land. They do everything possible in a lot of cases to try to avoid WOTUS or any impacts to WOTUS. And what we're seeing here are things that are going to have ripple effects throughout the agricultural economy, not only impacting farmers and ranchers, but impacting the quality and the abundance of our food supply.
Mr. Schiff, today we have heard multiple examples of the Army Corps implementing the WOTUS rule, nearly to the point where the property that is subject to the permitting loses its value. When ag land is subject to burdensome and unreasonable permitting requirements based on incomplete information or the illegal implementation of regulations, landowners lose the ability to cultivate and properly manage their land, which essentially prohibits farmers and ranchers from using the land which they rightfully own. Would you consider this illegal implementation of a WOTUS rule a regulatory taking by the Army Corps of Engineers? And if so, what recourse do the property owners have to prevent the Army Corps from devaluing their property to the point that it becomes practically unsaleable?
Thank you, Senator Rounds, for that question. I do believe that in many of these instances there would be a regulatory taking. The idea is that the Constitution says that the government cannot take your property for public use without just compensation, and the Supreme Court has made clear that that includes in cases where, through environmental or other regulation, you can no longer do anything with your property and therefore no longer have any value left. And oftentimes, with respect to the implementation of the Clean Water Act, that is the result. One big obstacle that property owners have, though, to vindicating their property rights when they are told they can't use it and they seek compensation is the general rule that one cannot seek compensation until one has first applied for a permit. And unfortunately, federal agencies, including the Army Corps, oftentimes know this and will drag out the permitting process in order to prevent a claim from being ripened. Or what they may do, they may very well recognize that just the permitting process itself can oftentimes cost more than the value of the property in question. And so essentially it gives a landowner no effective remedy.
Mr. Parrish or Ms. Galloway, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just the cost of getting a permit, a nationwide 40 permit in California is close to $40,000, and that's just with a half acre or 300 linear feet of fill. So if you exceed that, you're at an individual permit. The cost of that in California is $350,000. Those costs do not include mitigation, which can also be $300,000, $400,000 an acre.
I think the ranking member has brought up something which I think is important, and that is that what we have to begin with is a statute. And I don't think any of us disagree with the statute itself. I think the challenge for us is whether or not the implementation of the statute within either the existing a language of rules prior to the implementation of WOTUS are appropriate, or if they are so ambiguous that we literally need to upgrade them, or if the WOTUS would have been a better alternative, which I don't think it was. I think they went way beyond that. But I do think that we have to get back to, as the ranking member suggested, a more clear and definitive definition of an understanding of what the statute really implied in the first place. And if we want to change it to the point where to where it looks something like what WOTUS did, then I think they have to come back to Congress to actually request permission to expand it over and above what the statute provided for in the first place. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you.